Today we're going to talk about an oft overlooked but much beloved console, the Sega Saturn. This was Sega's fourth system, coming in hot off the heels of their very successful Genesis system. The history of this system, its development, and its release is a story of mismanagement, snap reactions to increasing pressure in the gaming market in the mid-90s. Development of the Saturn started in 1993, with the intent of building a system that would be more compatible with Sega's Model 2 board that they were using in the arcades at that time. Sega really wanted a way to more accurately port over the more popular arcade titles that they had to the home market. This became a point of contention between Sega of Japan and Sega of America. Sega of America proposed working with Silicon Graphics and making a more 3D-oriented system. When that was turned down, Kalinske from Sega of America and Mike Scholl from Sony of America proposed teaming up to build a joint Sony-Sega console. Again, they were turned down by Sega of Japan, who felt that the architecture that they wanted to build would better suit what they had planned for the arcades in the coming year. Kalinske was starting to get increasingly frustrated with Sega of Japan's unwillingness to listen. He suspected that the hardware design would be difficult to sell to Western developers. That would allow Sony's upcoming PlayStation to start eating away at the market share that they'd worked so hard to gain during the Genesis era. In the end, it wouldn't matter. Sega of Japan would stick with the initial plans, and Sega would build a system that would have not one, but two RISC-based processors and a separate video display processor to help smooth out the 2D processing. This is where some of Sega's problems come in. You see, this kind of hardware is notoriously difficult to program for. On one hand, it's incredibly flexible, allowing developers to do almost anything they wanted within the limitations of the hardware, all the way down to the bare metal level. However, the cost of that flexibility was increased difficulty in development for the system. In short, it was a pain in the ass to develop for. This would obviously slow down development time, making games more slow to come out than Sega would want, a problem that the PlayStation would not have at its launch. Oddly enough, some of the trouble with the system actually started with something that was totally unrelated to the system itself: 32X. Sega was getting increasingly worried about the impending launch of Atari's Jaguar console. He made a call to Joe Miller, who was the senior VP of product development at Sega of America. In a quick conversation between him and Nakayama, the VP of Sega of Japan, they outlined a system meant to be a stopgap between the Genesis and the Saturn, intended to ease customers into the 32-bit era by the way of a system they codenamed Jupiter. Joe and his team would eventually suggest coming up with an add-on intended to work with the already successful Genesis product called the 32X. This would bring a limited 3D capability to the aging system and lengthen its lifespan. They suspected this would work well, as the Sega CD had been very successful at limiting any impact that TurboGrafx 16 had with its Turbo Duo, so why wouldn't it work at countering the Jaguar till the Saturn was ready to launch? This honestly could have worked if it had been fleshed out better, but the system was developed and released so quickly that games were scarce, and most were leery of it to begin with, having already heard about the Saturn and the PlayStation being so close to release. It also didn't help that the 32X launched after the Saturn in Japan, and given Sega and Nintendo's preference towards the Japanese market versus the American market, it never really got any support because it never really took off. The players already had access to the Saturn. With both being out at the same time, and the Saturn being much more capable than an add-on device for the Genesis, interest never really took off for the small add-on unit, as most opted for the Saturn even though it was twice as expensive. Again, this wouldn't have been much of an issue by itself, save for the fact that the USA, one of Sega's biggest markets at the time, wouldn't see the Saturn for almost a year after its release in Japan. Couple that with a 32X's less than stellar reception rate, and you can already see the start of where this is going. It didn't help that Sony released in Japan just a few short weeks after the Saturn on December 3rd of 1994, and almost immediately started to gain ground on the Saturn. They did this by attracting many third-party developers to their platform with a $10 licensing fee, excellent development tools, and an introduction of a 7 to 10 day ordering system that allowed publishers to meet demand more efficiently than the 10 to 12 week lead time that cartridges had had in the past. Meanwhile, consumers in the United States would end up picking up the 32X, most with a bit of trepidation because Sega had a growing reputation of under-supporting add-ons to the Genesis already, the converter being mostly useless due to almost no Master System of the games being available at retail shortly after the Genesis launch. The Sega CD, while good in its own right, had a spotty game reputation and was often viewed as not having enough games to warrant its $200 price tag. Now they're being offered the 32X, which had less than a handful of games at launch, most not offering that much of an improvement over what they had, save one, Virtua Fighter. Couple that with rumors abounding about a new silicon-based graphics system from Nintendo and the Sony PlayStation due out to come out any month from now, you can see why the average consumer would start to be leery of another $200 add-on. This lack of consumer confidence and confusion in the Sega brand would continue as Mark Kalinske would walk on stage at E3 and announce not only was the Saturn releasing early in the US, but it was on shelves now for the price of $399. The crowd went wild, or they would have had Sony not done this.
$299.
That was it. Sony took all the thunder out of the Saturn launch almost immediately. Not only that, the early launch infuriated several major retailers who dropped Sega's entire lineup entirely in response to being excluded from the early launch. This included KB Toys, Best Buy, and Walmart. Sega was in trouble. They didn't have enough titles for the early launch, and Sony had undercut their launch price by $100. On top of that, retailers were dropping them for breaking the launch date without supplying them with consoles. This obviously confused consumers who were hurriedly trying to go to the stores to find the system, only to find out that not only was the system not there, but almost nothing of the Sega lineup was in stock at all. It likely didn't help that there were ads all over the place telling people that it was available, with a $50 million ad campaign being put out to accompany the early release. On top of that, they only had 6 games at launch as well, all of them by Sega, as all the third-party titles were slated to be ready by the original launch date. Kalinske could see the writing on the wall at this point. He went on to say, everybody knows that you have to have an adequate amount of software and enough games on the hardware platform in order to make it successful. We didn't have it. I could see this was going to be a failure. We go on to say this as well. Had we waited until we had more and better games, launching with all retailers instead of a few, with marketing that could reach every player, we would have been much more successful, even if that meant waiting till late October or November launch. In hindsight, it's hard to say that he was wrong. Waiting longer would have given them a much better selection of games at launch, which would have kept their agreements with the retailers. Retailers in turn would not have dropped them like they did, and they would have had a much larger presence in the market than they ended up with. This left Sega on the back foot. Not only had they eroded customer confidence over the years with many expensive add-ons that arguably didn't expand on the Genesis enough to warrant their cost, they had a system that was hard to program for, which made the games come out more slowly than the competing system that was retailing for $100 less than their platform. It also left them in a bind with retail stores, as many had cut them out entirely for breaking the original agreement. Just a year or more after the launch of the Saturn, Sega would take another hit. Kalinske, frustrated with his inability to be heard in Sega's management structure, left the company. 2 years later, Saturn would be discontinued, selling only 9 million units total and being absolutely crushed in the market, with Nintendo selling 33 million units and the PlayStation selling over 100 million units. This wouldn't be the end of Sega, as it would go on to release another console, one held almost more dear to retro gamers than even the Saturn, the Dreamcast. But that is a story for another day. Today, people look back fondly on the Saturn. Its impressive hardware, flexibility in programming, small library of games actually worked to its advantage. It was able to pull off many of the things that some other systems weren't able to pull off in that time, and its small library of games left it with little in the way of bloat, making each title almost a gem in its own right. With a longer view, better planning, and more confident management, Saturn could have gone on to succeed and further Sega's influence, in not only the American market, but worldwide. As it stands, their inability to listen to the advice of those who were in touch with those markets, and making multiple snap reactions to systems, ultimately led to the very thing that they hoped to avoid: lack of customer confidence and retailer confidence. This doomed the system before it could ever make much of a foothold. Had they looked at the larger picture and the changing winds of the market, from arcade ports to games solely made from consoles themselves, they would have been better able to adapt to the coming changes. Who knows? Had they worked with Sony, we could have had the Sega Station, or the Sony Saturn, with wide third-party support, leaving Sega the dominant player in the market and not Sony. However, their distrust not only of Sega of America, but of Sony, and their own lack of confidence in their brand, would lead them down a road of self-destruction that they would struggle with from this point forward. We could speculate all day about what could have been, but the fact remains that Sega has ever been its own worst enemy in the markets that it's been in. and it ultimately led to their own downfall. Right now, I'd like to take a moment and thank you for watching. Hopefully you enjoyed the video and provided some insight as to why the Saturn had such a rough go of it during its lifespan. If you did enjoy this video, please give it a thumbs up. If you find more of my content that you like, hit the subscribe button and the notify bell. That way you don't miss any future content. But, till next time, happy gaming!